What if everything you have been told about this war is only half true? Right now, two of the most powerful institutions on Earth are telling you two completely different stories about the same night. One says Iran's missile program is finished, the other says it is very much alive. Somebody is wrong, and by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why that matters to you. Before we go any further, I need 3 things from you. Hit like right now, because this video took real research and real time to put together, and that small click tells me it was worth it. Subscribe, because this story is not over. It is only getting started, and you do not want to miss what comes next. And send this to one person who still thinks this war is simple, because it is not, and they deserve to know that too. Let's start with what actually happened, because the background here matters more than people realize. Early in 2026, the United States and Israel launched a massive coordinated military campaign against Iran. This was not a small operation. In a single 12-hour window, close to 900 strikes hit Iranian missile sites, air defense systems, military infrastructure, and top leadership targets. This was one of the most intense bombing campaigns the region has seen in decades. Among the casualties in that opening wave was Iran's supreme leader, along with dozens of senior officials. It was a decapitation strike aimed at the very top of the Iranian chain of command. But war is never clean. In that same wave of strikes, a missile hit a girls' school near a naval base, killing around 170 people. Real families, real lives. This is not a video game. Every number you hear from this point forward represents actual human beings caught inside a war most of them never asked for. In response, Iran fired back. Missiles and drones were launched at American bases, embassies, and oil infrastructure across the region, including vessels moving through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important shipping routes on the planet. What started as a single strike turned into weeks of exchanges, each side hitting the other, each side claiming the upper hand. And this is where the story gets interesting, because it is not really about who launched what missile on what day. It is about a much bigger question. Did the United States actually succeed in destroying Iran's missile program the way it has repeatedly claimed? Or is that claim bigger than reality? Here is the tension at the center of everything. The White House has said in plain and confident language that Iran's ballistic missile and drone attacks are down 90%. It has said Iran's navy is wiped out. It has said 2/3 of Iran's missile production facilities are damaged or destroyed. Officials have described Iran as being decimated militarily, with its only real option left being to sit down and negotiate. President Trump himself has gone even further at times, saying Iran's air defenses are completely gone, that Iran has no air force left, and that the vast majority of Iran's missiles and launchers have already been taken out. At one point, a senior American commander said that within 4 minutes of Iran launching a missile, the launcher that fired it was being hit. That is an extraordinary claim. If true, it would mean the United States has built a targeting system so fast and so precise that Iran cannot fire a single missile without losing the platform that fired it almost immediately. That would represent one of the most significant military achievements in modern history. But here is where things start to unravel a little, and where you need to pay very close attention. Just weeks after some of these confident statements were made, a very different picture began leaking out. Not from Iran, not from a foreign government, but from inside American intelligence itself. According to multiple sources familiar with internal intelligence assessments, the real picture looks far less complete than the public statements suggest. Roughly half of Iran's missile launchers were still believed to be intact. Thousands of one-way attack drones were still sitting in Iran's arsenal, untouched. And despite 5 weeks of continuous strikes from both American and Israeli forces, Iran was still considered capable of causing serious damage across the region if it chose to. Read that again. Half. Not all destroyed. Half still standing, according to people with direct access to the intelligence being generated on this exact question. That single detail alone should stop you from accepting either version of this story too quickly, because it sits right in the middle of two very confident, very opposite narratives. And it is worth remembering that this intelligence assessment did not come from a hostile source trying to undermine the operation. It came from within the same government making the confident public statements. That is what makes this gap so genuinely strange. It is not a foreign adversary contradicting the United States. It is the United States in one form, quietly disagreeing with itself in another. Now, when this information became public, the response from officials was immediate and forceful. A Pentagon spokesperson pushed back hard, disputing the reporting altogether. An administration official insisted that Iran's ballistic missiles were being destroyed rapidly, painting a picture of a regime in free fall with no real path forward except surrender at the negotiating table. So now you have two groups of professionals, both with access to real information, both speaking with confidence, and both telling the public something different. One side says the threat is basically gone. The other side, from inside the same government, says a significant and dangerous capability still remains. This is the actual story. Not a clean, simple headline about an overnight miracle. A messy, complicated, very human situation where even the people closest to the truth cannot fully agree on what that truth is. If you are finding this useful, do me a quick favor. Tap that subscribe button if you have not already, because we are going deeper into this, and I promise the next part will change how you think about every war headline you read from now on. And if a friend of yours has been arguing with you about this exact topic, this is the video to send them, because it lays out both sides fairly, without picking a team just to get views. Let's talk about why this gap between official statements and internal intelligence exists in the first place, because it is not necessarily about anyone lying. Modern warfare has a strange and uncomfortable truth buried inside it. The moment a bomb explodes, nobody actually knows for certain what it destroyed. What you get first is called an initial assessment. Pilots report what they believe they hit. Satellites take pictures through smoke and dust. Analysts make their best guess based on incomplete information. This early picture almost always looks more dramatic and more complete than what turns out to be. True once the smoke clears and better information comes in. This is not a new problem. It has happened in almost every major air campaign in modern history. Governments, under enormous pressure to show results, tend to announce the most optimistic version of events first. Later, weeks or months down the line, quieter and less publicized assessments often reveal a more complicated picture. Sometimes, facilities that were declared destroyed were only damaged. Sometimes, mobile equipment believed eliminated had simply been moved before the strike ever landed. Iran, in particular, built its missile program around exactly this problem. For decades, Iranian military planners understood they could never match the United States or Israel in fighter jets, aircraft carriers, or open battlefield combat. So they invested almost everything into something harder to destroy, a missile force that did not depend on air superiority to be dangerous. They spread their weapons across underground facilities carved into mountains, hidden storage sites, and mobile launchers that move constantly and are never in the same place twice. Iranian commanders have publicly referred to some of these locations as underground missile cities, built specifically to survive exactly the kind of massive strike campaign we saw in early 2026. The entire design philosophy was simple. Even if the enemy hits you first and hits you hard, you must still be able to hit back. And this is why destroying a missile program is almost never a single clean event, no matter how many strikes are launched in one night. You're not looking for one target. You're looking for hundreds of hidden targets, some underground, some mobile, some deliberately built to look like something else entirely. And every single one of those targets was designed by people who spent 30 years studying exactly how the United States and Israel conduct these kinds of operations, specifically so they could build something harder to find and harder to kill. There is also a strategic reason for the confident public messaging, separate from the battlefield reality. Announcing total victory serves a purpose beyond simply informing the public. It puts pressure on Iran's leadership at the negotiating table. It reassures allies in the region who have lived under the threat of Iranian missiles for years. It signals strength to the rest of the world. None of that requires the claim to be perfectly accurate. It only requires the claim to be useful. That does not mean officials are being dishonest on purpose. It means the incentives around public statements and the incentives around quiet internal intelligence are simply not the same thing. One is built to reassure. The other is built to be accurate, even when accurate is uncomfortable. Now let's look at this from Israel's side, because their claims add another layer to this puzzle. Israeli military officials have said they destroyed roughly half of Iran's missile stockpile and prevented the production of at least 1,500 additional missiles that were in the pipeline. They described Iran as producing dozens of missiles per month before the strikes, with plans to scale that up to hundreds per month if left unchecked. If accurate, stopping that kind of production expansion is genuinely significant, even if it falls short of total elimination. Notice something important here. Even Israel's own claim is roughly half, not all. That number lines up surprisingly closely with the leaked American intelligence assessment, even though these are two separate militaries, two separate intelligence services, working somewhat independently. When two different sources land on a similar number, that number probably deserves more attention than a single dramatic headline claiming complete destruction. And then there is Iran's own version of events, which of course carries its own bias in the opposite direction. Iranian military leadership has publicly stated that the United States and Israel failed to destroy the country's missile capability, insisting their forces were able to strike back with meaningful force, even in the final days of the conflict. They have framed the entire campaign as a failure for the United States and Israel, a narrative aimed just as much at their own domestic audience as at the rest of the world. So here is where we actually stand. The American public messaging says total collapse. Leaked American intelligence says roughly half remains. Israeli claims say roughly half destroyed. Iranian claims say their capability survived largely intact. None of these four positions is neutral. Every single one of them comes from a source with a reason to shape the story in a particular direction. This is exactly why understanding how to read a war, rather than just reacting to a headline, matters so much. The truth is rarely sitting in any single official statement. It is usually somewhere in the friction between competing claims, and figuring out where that truth actually lives takes patience. Most people are not willing to give a 15-second headline. There is another piece of this puzzle that almost nobody talks about, and it involves the weapons themselves. Reports have suggested that during this campaign, the United States used a huge share of its long-range precision missile stockpile, including newer systems that were still relatively limited in supply. Some of these weapons were designed to strike hardened and time-sensitive targets with extreme accuracy, but they are expensive, complex to build, and not something that gets replaced overnight. If a large portion of that stockpile was used in just a few weeks of fighting, that raises an uncomfortable question. What happens if this conflict flares up again next month or next year, and the weapons built specifically for this kind of mission are not sitting in the warehouse the way they were before? There have also been reports that military leaders quietly warned that stockpiles of defensive weapons, the systems designed to shoot down incoming missiles before they hit anything, were running low as well. If that is true, it changes the entire calculation. It is one thing to say you destroyed most of an enemy's offense. It is another thing entirely to say you still have enough defense left to handle whatever that enemy has remaining. Those two questions are connected, and the public conversation almost never covers both of them together. This is part of why some reports suggested plans for a second larger wave of strikes inside Iran were quietly shelved, not necessarily because the mission was unnecessary, but because military advisors were worried about running short on both offensive and defensive weapons at the same time. Officials have since disputed exactly why that decision was made, with some pointing instead to pressure from Gulf allies who did not want the region pushed into an even wider war. Either explanation tells you the same underlying thing. Even the most powerful military in the world has limits, and those limits shape decisions just as much as battlefield success does. Let's zoom out now, because there is real historical precedent here, and it tells us something important about what is realistic to expect. In 1991, during the Gulf War, the United States launched what became known as the Great Scud Hunt, an enormous effort dedicating massive resources specifically toward finding and destroying Iraq's mobile missile launchers. Aircraft flew constant patrols. Intelligence assets were poured into the problem. And by the end of the war, official assessments made bold claims about how many launchers had been destroyed. Years later, deeper investigations revealed a much less impressive reality. Despite enormous effort, the campaign struggled to confirm even a small number of actual mobile launcher kills with a real confidence. The missiles kept moving, they kept hiding, and the fundamental challenge of finding something specifically designed not to be found turned out to be far harder than anyone wanted to admit in the moment. That lesson has echoed through every major missile suppression campaign since. Mobile, hidden, and hardened targets are simply one of the most difficult problems in modern warfare. Technology has improved enormously since 1991. Intelligence fusion, satellite coverage, drone surveillance, and precision weapons have all advanced by generations. But the core problem has not disappeared. You cannot destroy what you cannot find. And an adversary that has spent decades learning how to stay hidden does not become easy to find overnight, no matter how many strikes you launch in a single 12-hour window. This does not mean the 2026 campaign accomplished nothing. It almost certainly did real, serious damage. A 90% drop in missile and drone attacks, if that figure holds up, is a massive operational achievement by any standard. Destroying 2/3 of production facilities, if accurate, sets Iran's ability to rebuild back by years, not days. These are not small outcomes. They represent a genuine and significant blow to Iran's military capability. Consider what it actually takes to rebuild a missile production facility once it has been seriously damaged. This is not something you fix with a weekend of repairs. You need specialized machinery, much of which is not easy to acquire under international sanctions. You need engineers with very specific expertise. You need supply chains for components that cannot simply be bought off a shelf. Even if Iran wanted to fully restore its production capacity tomorrow, the realistic timeline for doing so likely stretches into years, not months. That single fact alone matters enormously, regardless of exactly how you interpret the competing damage assessments, because it tells you something about the shape of the next few years, even amid all this uncertainty. But there is a very real difference between severely damaging a program and completely eliminating it, and that difference matters enormously for what happens next. A severely damaged program can still fire missiles. It can still threaten ships in the Strait of Hormuz. It can still support proxy groups across the region. A completely eliminated program cannot do any of those things. The gap between those two outcomes is the gap between a temporary pause in tension and a genuinely new era of regional security. This also matters for something much bigger than Iran alone. If a country can build a missile program specifically engineered to survive even the most intense modern strike campaign, and that program does, in fact, survive in some meaningful form, that lesson gets studied by every other government watching from the sidelines. North Korea is watching. Other regional powers are watching. The core question they are all asking is simple. Does dispersal, hardening, and mobility still work as a defense against modern precision warfare, or has that strategy finally been solved? Think about what this means for Iran's neighbors specifically, because their entire security planning depends on the answer. Israel has spent years and enormous amounts of money building layered missile defense systems specifically because of the threat coming from Iran. Every time Iran launches a large salvo, that defense network gets tested under real pressure, and every interception, every miss, every near hit becomes data that shapes future defense spending. If Iran's launch capability really has dropped by 90%, Israel's defense planners can start shifting resources and attention toward other threats. If it is only dropped by half, they cannot afford to relax at all because half of a serious missile force is still a serious missile force. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates face a similar calculation, but through a different lens. Their most immediate missile threat has not come directly from Iran itself, but from Iranian-backed groups operating in Yemen, armed with Iranian technology, Iranian components, and Iranian expertise. If the source of that support has genuinely been crippled, the threat picture in Yemen changes with it over time. If it has only been partially disrupted, those attacks are likely to continue in some form, just with fewer resources behind them. This single unresolved question, how much of Iran's program actually survived, has consequences that ripple far beyond Iran's own borders and into the daily security planning of an entire region. Then, there's the wider network Iran has spent decades building outside its own borders. Groups in Lebanon, in Iraq, and in Syria, all connected in different ways to Iranian weapons, training, and strategic direction. Much of what these groups have been able to do over the years traces back to the same missile and weapons infrastructure being discussed here. If that infrastructure has genuinely been crippled at its source, the ripple effects reach well beyond Iran's own borders and into every one of these regional relationships, potentially reshaping conflicts that have simmered for years. If it has not been crippled, very little actually changes for the people living under the shadow of those proxy forces, no matter what headline they read that week. The honest answer, based on everything we actually know right now, is that we do not fully know yet. The public statements say it has been solved. The leaked intelligence says it has not, at least not completely. And history tells us to be patient before believing the more dramatic version of any story, because dramatic first reports have a long track record of not holding up once the full picture comes into focus weeks or months later. That patience is uncomfortable. Human beings like clean answers. We like knowing who won and who lost, and we like knowing it right now, not in 6 months. So this is once the full assessment quietly gets published in a report almost nobody reads. But real wars, unlike movies, rarely hand you that kind of clean resolution on the night it happens. The resolution, if it ever fully arrives at all, tends to show up slowly, in pieces, long after most viewers have already stopped watching. Before we go further, quick pause. If your brain just connected a dot it had not connected before, that is exactly the reaction this channel is built around. Hit that like button so this reaches someone else who is still stuck believing the simple version of this story. And if you want to actually see how this uncertainty resolves over the coming weeks, subscribe now, because I will be tracking every update, every new leak, and every new claim as it happens, not just the version that trends first. There's also a human cost to this uncertainty that rarely makes it into the headlines. Families in the region are living under the real possibility that this is not actually finished. Israeli citizens who spent months running to bomb shelters during missile salvos do not get to relax simply because an official statement says the threat is gone. Gulf state governments planning their own security investments cannot afford to guess wrong about how much capability Iran genuinely retains. And ordinary people across Iran, Israel, and the wider region are left waiting to see whether this quiet period is a real ending or simply the pause between one chapter of this conflict and the next. This is also why calibrated, careful information matters so much more than a confident viral headline. If governments and citizens make decisions based on the belief that a threat is completely gone, when in reality half of it is still standing, that is not just a media inaccuracy. That is a mistake with the potential for enormous real-world consequences. Wars have restarted before because someone believed the threat was over when it was not. Think about the people actually carrying out an operation like this too, because their reality rarely makes it into any official statement. Pilots flying into contested airspace do not get to know in advance. whether the target below them is truly what intelligence believes it to be. Ground crews loading precision weapons trust that the coordinates they were given are accurate, because a single mistake at that stage can mean the difference between hitting a legitimate military target and causing exactly the kind of tragedy that struck that girls' school near Bandar Abbas. Analysts sitting in front of screens thousands of miles away have to make judgment calls under intense time pressure, knowing that being wrong in either direction carries a real cost, either missing a genuine threat or striking something that should never have been hit at all. None of this is meant to glorify war or to make it sound clean and heroic. It is meant to remind you that behind every confident headline and every disputed intelligence leak, there are real human beings making decisions with incomplete information, under enormous pressure, with consequences that cannot be undone once a weapon leaves the rail. That reality does not fit neatly into a 30-second clip, but it is the truth sitting underneath every single number we have talked about in this video. It is easy to reduce a war to statistics, percentages, and dueling press releases. It is much harder and much more important to remember that every one of those statistics represents a decision made by an actual person, sitting in an actual moment with far less certainty than any headline ever admits. So where does that leave us right now with everything we have just walked through? Something significant did happen in early 2026. This was not a minor skirmish. It was one of the largest coordinated military campaigns against Iran in modern history, involving hundreds of strikes, serious casualties, and a real disruption to Iran's missile production and launch capability. That part is not in serious dispute by anyone, no matter which government or which analyst you choose to believe on the finer details. What remains genuinely uncertain is how complete that disruption actually was. The most confident public claims describe near total destruction. The most credible leaked intelligence describes something closer to a serious but partial degradation, with real capability still remaining. Both of these things can be true at once in different ways. The campaign could be historically significant and still fall short of the complete elimination that some of the loudest headlines have claimed. What this moment really teaches us is something bigger than just this one conflict. It teaches us how to actually watch a war unfold in real time, not by grabbing the first confident headline and treating it as permanent fact. Not by assuming every government statement is either completely true or completely false, but by watching how the story evolves over days and weeks, by noticing when official claims and internal intelligence start to disagree, and by asking who benefits from each version of the story before deciding which one to believe. The people who will actually understand what happened in this war are not the ones who accepted the first dramatic headline. They are the ones who kept watching after the headline faded, who noticed when the quieter, more complicated version of the story started leaking out, and who were willing to sit with uncertainty instead of rushing toward the most satisfying answer. It also helps to remember why this exact pattern keeps repeating, war after war, decade after decade. In the opening days of any major conflict, there is a strong incentive to project strength, and confident numbers travel faster and further than cautious ones ever will. A headline claiming complete victory gets shared. A quieter internal memo describing partial success gets buried. This is not a new phenomenon created by this particular war. It is a pattern that has shown up in nearly every major military campaign of the last several decades, and it will almost certainly show up again in whatever the next major conflict turns out to be. Recognizing that pattern does not mean assuming every government statement is false. It means understanding that the first version of any war story is usually the most simplified version, built for speed and impact rather than complete accuracy. The fuller picture almost always arrives later, quieter and with far less attention than the headline that came before it. If you only ever remember the first version, you are working with an incomplete map of what actually happened, and incomplete maps lead to bad conclusions about what comes next. There is one more layer worth sitting with before we wrap up, and it has to do with what happens after a story like this fades from the headlines. Most people will move on within days. The news cycle will shift to the next crisis, the next controversy, the next thing demanding attention. But the situation on the ground in Iran, in Israel, and across the wider region does not pause just because public attention moves elsewhere. Whatever capability genuinely remains, whether it is closer to the confident public numbers or closer to the more cautious intelligence assessments, continues to shape decisions being made in government buildings long after most of us have stopped paying attention. That gap between public attention and ongoing reality is exactly where the next surprising headline usually comes from. That is genuinely rare in how most people consume news today. And if you made it this far, you are clearly one of those people, someone who wants the real picture, not just the version that is easiest to believe. So here's my last ask, and it is a simple one. If this video actually helped you understand this story more clearly than the confident, one-sided version you have probably seen elsewhere, that is exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe if you want to keep seeing wars and world events broken down this way. with both sides shown honestly instead of just the version that gets the most clicks. Like this video, so it reaches someone else who is tired of being told a simple story about something that is genuinely complicated. And share it with the one person in your life who needs to hear both sides of this before they make up their mind. Because in the end, the real story was never really about whether a missile program was destroyed in a single night. It was about whether we, as an audience, are willing to look past the loudest headline and actually find out what is true. That question matters far beyond this one war, and it is a question worth carrying into every single headline you read from here on out. Somewhere between the confident press conference and the quiet leaked memo, the real answer is waiting. It always is. Most people will never go looking for it. If you're still here, you already have. Keep that habit, and no headline will ever be able to fool you the way it fools everyone else.